Ja, herzlichen Dank für die Vorstellung und für die Möglichkeit, hier zu sprechen. Seit gut 20 Jahren begleite ich
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I've been accompanying women who have experienced abuse for a good 20 years, and I want to describe to you the experiences of those affected. These experiences
Dieses Buch ist vor einem Jahr hier
are described in the book Storytelling as Resistance, or Narrative as Resistance, which was published here in Germany a year ago. And in it, 23 women tell of sexual and spiritual abuse they experienced as adults in the church. Now, I want to bundle the experiences of those affected into three first-person statements that can give an insight into the inner experience of those affected. And then I shall describe to you the difficulties victims or survivors have in the follow-up to their lives. So the first fundamental experience is thinking, I am to blame. We have heard this over and over again. Abuse, there are several types of abuse, and abuse never comes suddenly. It is embedded in a very slow strategy of initiation, in spiritual accompaniment, in confessional talks, in retreats. The woman confides in her spiritual father. And finally, there is someone who listens, who has time, who's there for me. And then insidiously, the first assaults start. The too long hug, the hand on the thigh, the sentence, I'll show you God's love. The affected woman no longer knows what to do. She doesn't really like this situation. She's confused and no longer trusts her own perception. What happens in the abuse? It shames the woman. It creates a situation, a feeling of shame in her. She takes over the feelings that actually belong on the side of the abuser. She begins to believe that she herself is involved, that she's the guilty person in the story. She's emotionally at the mercy of the abuser, and in this total dependency, it is easier to assume one's own guilt than to realize that someone has made a woman the plaything of his power. The moment victims talk about abuse, they always have to expect that those around them will blame them. Then they hear sentences like, well, she's an adult and she can say no. So this sentence is nothing more than an apportionment of blame. Second fundamental experience, the feeling that I am a puppet. I am a puppet. In her account in the book Narrative as a Resistance, a victim describes in a very stark and blunt way how she felt. She says, I had become a puppet in his hands. The perpetrator manipulated her spiritually, and the physical assaults were presented as a proof of Jesus' love. By interpreting biblical passages, he demanded absolute obedience from the woman who was inescapably at his mercy. She had become a puppet. Whoever pulled the strings of the puppet, she would do what was demanded of her. And this inner experience of not being able to act for oneself can become very deeply engraved in our soul. And the third fundamental experience, I am alone. In a situation of abuse, the affected person feels all alone. She feels all alone with the abuse experience, and often that remains for a long time. It is the inner silence on the one hand, and a church environment in which abuse may not be spoken about on the other hand, that reinforce and cement the isolation. And in spite of these inner experiences, that is, I am to blame, I feel like a puppet, I am alone, those affected have begun to talk about the abuse eventually. These women are brave and strong because their storytelling is dangerous for them. They must always expect difficulties, which I will describe now in the second part of my sharing. And again, I will talk about three aspects, 3 points. The first experience, the experience of abused women, is they're told this is your personal problem. That is the individual case theory. If a woman, as an adult, experiences abuse in the church or speaks about it, this has an impact on the whole system into which she speaks. For example, if the woman lives in a community as a religious, for example, her speaking about the abuse unsettles the self-image of the community as a whole and her fellow sisters. It is an imposition to imagine how the fellow sister became a victim and no one noticed anything. It is just unbearable to imagine that confession and spiritual accompaniment became dangerous places. Victims, therefore, often experience that their experience of abuse is considered to be an individual problem, and it is easier to assume that it is an individual case than to question their own structures and institutional self-image is smaller. The person affected is aware of this. She's told this abuse is your problem. That is your personal problem. And this, of course, reinforces the feeling of being all alone. Second experience. Now, we need to be good. The stigmatization as a victim. Victims are increased. Now you need to be good, to behave good. Victims increasingly experience that church and religious leaders initially react empathetically, cautiously, and with partiality. They are listened to and encouraged to report the abuse. But it is extremely difficult for the person concerned to be constantly confronted with the difficult and often traumatizing experiences that she has had. She holds on to the hope that things will get better, that justice will be done to her. But experience shows that proceedings take years and the affected person is poorly informed. She has to endure this pending state, and in the end, what would be desirable very rarely comes out. And the most agonizing reaction to talking about the abuse is that silence ensures. There are no reactions. People around the victims become impatient. They want the continued suffering to end. The person affected reacts. Now she needs to be good. She feels branded as a difficult person. And again, she's the one who is somehow to blame for not doing well, for not behaving good. So she becomes the scapegoat again, the black sheep. And I see women leaders and decision makers in communities who accompany those affected with patience, partiality, and attentiveness. However, I also come across sentences that say someone really has to keep this issue at bay. Affected people are pigeonholed and confronted with contemptuous cliches about them. Point number 3, love can bear anything, the danger of spiritual narcotization. I observe a specifically Catholic way in which the scandal of abuse against adult women, especially women religious, is spiritually dismissed. The event is spiritually dressed up. Spiritual ideals foster a climate in which abuse can occur and continue. The willingness to surrender, to override one's own needs and be obedient, not to assert one's own head, one's own mind, to be ready for forgiving love. All these are ideals that make it difficult for those affected. I see women who try again and again to come to terms with the spiritual abuse, remembering that the abuser is only a human. By forgiving and bearing with love, they feel the pressure of expectation from their own environment, that as a Christian, it would be good for her to act out of Christian ideals. But in the short term, this narcotizes the pain. In the long term, however, post-traumatic symptoms reappear. The victim continues to feel bound to the perpetrator like a puppet and falls into the role of a failure. We in the Christian congregations and communities have to question ourselves critically whether these spiritual ideals that promoted the abuse are the attitudes to deal with the abuse. You know, there is an exclamation mark on the book after the word enough. Enough, exclamation mark. People need to speak up. This is fundamental.